My name is Nicola Binetti. In the study, which represents a collaboration between Queen Mary University of London, University College London, and the University of Bath, I'm going to present to you a tool and accompanying data set that represent a novel approach to the study of emotion expressions. Okay, let's start off with some background information. Facial expressions provide us with a nonverbal channel to share emotional information with others. In order for this to work, there has to be a consensus within a group of how specific morphological features map onto distinct emotional categories. Seminal work carried out in the 70s introduced the idea of a universality of facial expressions, essentially aimed at identifying a core set of expressions that are universally understood and that transcend cultural barriers, and at providing a description of the facial features that describe this core set. However, more recent studies have challenged this idea of universality in favor of a specificity of emotional representations, meaning that people might not actually be that consistent in terms of how they represent core emotion categories. This is evidenced by individual differences in emotion processing. For instance, personality traits such as trait anxiety affects how quickly people visually identify and respond to fearful stimuli. You have another example with neuroticism that is known, for example, to modulate neural responses to emotional stimuli. Further evidence of specificity comes also from studies looking at people's representations of core emotions inferred through perceptual performance measures, which vary based on cultural background. While there undoubtedly is a wide agreement on how basic emotions are expressed, the bottom line here is that individuals don't necessarily process emotions in the same way, and this may suggest a specificity of emotional representations, where at an extreme, we can consider that every individual might have his or her unique take on how a given emotion type should look like. In our study, we wanted to directly probe and quantitatively describe representations of core expressions constructed through a genetic algorithm, map these representations in a large test sample, so identify, for example, core sets of features that describe these representations, and look at how these representations vary and overlap across participants, and finally relate the specificity of representations to performance in an emotion identification task. In order to do this, we use 3D facial stimuli controlled through 150 parameters called blend shapes, which essentially control sets of features such as the opening of the eyes or the curling of the edges of the mouth and so forth. We can generate expressions through a linear combination of weights along these 150 blend shapes. In essence, a specific set of blend shapes, set with specific weights, will result in a unique facial expression. Instead of having a 3D artist create expressions, we exploited a genetic algorithm to assist people in constructing a depiction of their ideal representation of a specific emotion. This involved a set of 10 iterations. On each iteration, participants are presented with a set of sample faces and select which faces are closest to a target emotion they're aiming for. Across iterations, faces are evolved based on a crossbreeding of blend shapes belonging to the selected faces with the addition of random mutations, eventually converging on the target expression by the 10th iteration. Each subject repeated this for 4 emotions: happy, fear, angry, and sad. After building each expression, we also asked participants to rate on a Likert scale, 1 being very poor, 7 very high, how closely the final expression generated by the algorithm aligned with the target expression they had in mind. We observed overall fairly high ratings, with a median score of 6 plus or minus 1. Here are some examples of expressions built by a few subjects. Just by sampling the data, you really can appreciate that there are several subtle, and in some instances not too subtle, variations within each category across different people. Having mapped representations for these 4 emotions in a large number of participants, we can look at several things such as how these representations are distributed, whether they're clustered, and to what extent these clusters are separable. Principal component analysis run on participant blend shapes reveals fairly distinct expression clusters for all 4 emotions. We can quantify the separation of these clusters via machine learning. We trained a support vector machine classifier at discriminating emotion category based on blend shapes of expressions belonging to a subset of participants. We then tested the classifier's ability of identifying the categories of previously unseen examples of these expressions belonging to a separate subset of participants. Based on classification performance, we can see, for example, that happy is the most highly discriminable category, whereas there is more overlap between negative emotions, angry, fear, and sad, and particularly between fear and sad. Another thing this approach allows us is to visualize core sets and variability of facial features for each emotion. The averaging of blend weights across all participants for a given emotion, the black solid line, gives us an idea of the core sets of facial features that describe representations of that emotion category. This can be rendered as a core average expression. The variability of blend weights, the red shaded region of the plots, tells us which features belonging to this core set vary the most between participants. Here, this is also rendered as a heat map. Since we established that people vary in terms of how they represent these core emotion categories, we wanted to relate the specificity of representations to perceptual performance measures. We tested a subset of 40 participants that had previously built representations for each emotion, and we had these subjects perform an emotion identification task on stimuli provided by a different subset of 40 participants. On every trial, they were presented with one face stimulus and asked to determine which of the 4 emotions the stimulus was expressing. We found that identification performance significantly varied as a function of the distance in face space between any given stimulus and the subject's own representation of that emotion type. In other words, the less a stimulus aligns with the subject's representation for that emotion, the poorer the subject's ability at correctly identifying the emotion category. To conclude, we describe a novel data-driven approach that exploits genetic algorithms, allowing subjects to construct a proxy of their internal representations of emotions. Based on the distribution of these representations, we describe the core set of features that define these emotion categories and how these representations vary and overlap in our large data set. Finally, we show that the performance in emotion identification tasks is explained by how closely stimuli align to each person's own emotion representations. This provides insights for studies focusing on individual differences and makes a case for creating stimuli that are custom suited to participants if required by the circumstances. I want to thank you for your interest in this talk, and happy to answer any questions or curiosities that you might have in person.